الله أكبر الله أكبر.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. We are gathering today because just about 24 hours ago it was announced that former President Nelson Mandela had passed away. And I was coming home from Howard University when I received the text alert from CNN. So when I came home, I immediately turned on the TV to see CNN. And today's talk, subhanAllah, began yesterday, although we didn't know that we would have this talk. So when I looked at the TV, they mentioned that he had passed away. And then the cameras went to South Africa and showed the home, outside the home of the former president and the area where he was. And people had gathered, news media had gathered. What I noticed interestingly was at least 3 Muslims identifiable with kufis and beards were among the people who were gathered just outside the home. And immediately I thought, subhanAllah, so even in his death, he is going to be recognized and, if you will, held in high esteem by the community with whom he was so intimate. And so today, when we were discussing the plan for today, because Imam Majid is at the ISNA headquarters in Indiana, where we'll have the Board of Trustees meeting for ISNA starting tomorrow. But I will go inshallah in the morning, so he's already there. And so when we discussed what should we talk about, should we continue what he does, then I suggested why don't we do something because of the timely nature of the event and the the high regard in which all of us hold the former president. So I also connected with my colleagues and friends in South Africa today, and one of them who I've been in touch with through the work of the Muslim Student Association, and she herself is a graduate of that effort, immediately messaged me back saying that this is what's happening. The Muslims in South Africa have issued statements, and we are very much saddened. And so I had a very on the ground sort of update. What I'm going to do is trace a little bit of the history of Muslims in South Africa. And instead of giving dry facts and figures, I'm going to use the words of prominent people in the South African Muslim tradition, including, but not limited to, Maulana Ibrahim Bham, B-H-A-M, who is a historian and has written quite a bit on the Muslims in South Africa, as well as the ambassador to America from South Africa, Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool. And then, of course, quotes from President Mandela, which are public statements, because many times we find that people in the present day may be friends with Muslims or be colleagues of Muslims or be associated with the community, but in the public settings they're often shy to mention that. And I have quotes that he made, public statements about that, and I'll show that inshallah as we move along. So in the very beginning he said this about when he was visiting a community in Johannesburg, South Africa. Former President Mandela said that during the Apartheid years, Muslims rose to the call to unite in struggle against oppression. Here in this area of Johannesburg, we witnessed resistance to the Group Areas Act, which will live in the annals of history. So immediately he was recognizing when he came out of prison the contribution of the Muslims. And in there are also lessons for us. So if we have time, inshallah, we'll connect it to the lessons for Muslims in America and how the migration to the US that began in 1965, there was a civil rights movement that was going on, but we don't have much evidence of an organized immigrant presence in that movement. And so we'll see lessons about what that could have done and would do for us, inshallah. When President Mandela was struggling, and before he had been in prison, he had associations with Muslims. So when he was in prison, he had associations with Muslims because many of his associates who were in the struggle had been imprisoned with him in Robben Island. And as I'll show, Robben Island has also been used as a prison much before the apartheid struggle. So Muslims have been there for a long time. And also, of course, when he came out, he joined them. This was just an image to show you, when they raised their hands in making dua, he joined, and he was just very much a part of that community. Ibrahim Rasool, the ambassador, who is now stationed in Washington, D.C., and you may have occasion to meet him, is also a son of that apartheid struggle, having also very much been a student leader during his college years. And so some of the quotes I'll use are from him. Among the things he tells us is that the migration to South Africa began over 300 years ago. And whereas America, we had the migration of Muslims both from the eastern coast, Atlantic Ocean migration, and the western coast, Pacific Ocean migration. Both of those, in the case of South Africa, all of it was very much on the eastern cape, if you will. And these are, the first quote that he says is that Muslims came to South Africa arriving as slaves and exiles because the Dutch had colonized much of what is present-day Indonesia and Malaysia. And so the Dutch were present there, and they had brought many of these people as slaves. And of course, they were brought also because the black population in South Africa, there's always a divide and conquer attitude, and they were brought in as a way to almost create a struggle between the pool of laborers and these existing Africans, if you will, within that area. He also tells us of the Indian ancestry. So we have the Malay ancestry. The Malay archipelago is known present day as Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia. And of course, Brunei is another part of that, but more so these three areas. That the eastern coast and what he calls Port Natal, the British colonists started bringing the transfer of Indians as laborers. And of course, this would mean subcontinent of India. This is before the partition into Pakistan, or even into to what is present-day Bangladesh, which is much later in 1971. And so this represents the second wave that he calls of Muslims to South Africa. And these people essentially were the laborers, the indentured laborers, and they didn't have absolutely any freedom, if you think of it in this sense, but they had a common ancestry, which was the Indian identity. On top of that, we also know from Maulana Ibrahim Bam, and this is interesting, wherever you follow the history of Islam, Azhar, the famous Islamic university in Egypt, traces its roots to an endowment given by a woman. In Al-Qarawayne in Morocco, traces its roots to endowment given by a woman to begin this effort. And here in Malaysia, in South Africa, we find that, and her name is a Dutch name, Sarti van de Kaap, so it could be possible, we don't know her actual ancestry, but she was born to slave parents, and slaves were given the names of the masters. This is why in American history, when you see the liberation movement of African Americans, you find them resisting the name of the master, and they started taking names such as, I don't know my name, so I will be X. In science, X being the unknown. So we don't know her actual ancestry, but she was the first masjid actually was built on land that she donated to the Muslim community of that time, and this is in the early 1800s. So how was the treatment of the Muslims? We hear about it present day, but how was the treatment of the Muslims? What we find is that Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool reminds us that during the Dutch rule, there was a clear mandate to stunt the growth of Islam. And it parallels what happened in America. It parallels the fact that African slaves were told and were actually forced to be stripped of all of their religious anything affiliation with Islam. And here what he says is that actually the Dutch made it a matter of punishment in three ways: confiscation of property if you had it, imprisonment if you had it, if you spoke out or practiced Islam, or just outright execution. So these were very real consequences for identifying with Islam, and even in that Islam survived. And that's the beauty of our religion, that even among the slaves in America, if you look at the history of Islam in America, you'll find that even though they were imprisoned and as slaves, essentially, they maintained in their DNA the practice of Islam. And so in America, you will not find masajids that were built in the 1800s. This is the same thing that happens in South Africa. You don't see the presence, as the ambassador says here, that resulted in the absence of any visible Islam, but in the forms of mosques and other institutions. So if you move from there, what essentially we're talking about is that the Dutch rule made it so that the Muslims were always going to be the other. They are not of Africa, they are not from Africa, and so that is not a religion. We know that Islam has always been in Africa from the first times, if you will, without even tracing the history of Musa alayhi salam and the people of Egypt and Fir'aun, but in the history, in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who sent the people who were oppressed in Mecca and gave them permission to make the first hijrah to what is present-day Ethiopia or Abyssinia. And you find now many communities that are of Ethiopian and also Eritrean descent will actually call their masajids in new lands the first hijrah masjid. If you go to Washington, D.C., close to Howard University, there's actually the masjid now called the first hijrah masjid, because they remember that it was the people, Christians, of under the rule of the king, the Najash, who actually gave them and welcomed them. So Islam has been in Africa, but the colonizers and the colonialists often made it a point to say that Islam is not of Africa and you should only be practicing the Christianity that was brought to them or the pagan religions, but not Islam. And so this was the first thing with Dutch rule. Of course, that had implications, and we'll see this, that during the actual apartheid period, so this is the 1800s, and as the Dutch became more powerful inside South Africa and became even as if they had a long plan to stay, they instituted the language of Afrikaans, which is very close to the Dutch language. If you hear any words of Dutch, in fact, the people of Netherlands who speak Dutch, and even parts of Belgium, and Flemish is very close to that, they can understand the people who speak Afrikaans, which was the language of the Dutch instituted inside South Africa. So during the apartheid rule, the Muslims had always been known, even then, as the organizers, as the people who could mobilize. Because one thing we have going for us, regardless of where we are, is on Fridays, regardless of what is happening, men were commanded to gather for Jummah prayer. So no matter where they were, they made sure that institution never died. Even if it was a few of them, they did it. If you visit the prisons in America today, the most calm time, the prison wardens will tell you, is during the Jummah prayer, when the Muslims, all the inmates, if there are many, sometimes there are more than 50, 75 in one prison, are gathering for the prayers. So this institution allowed them to stay together. In the apartheid period, under what was known as the National Party at the beginning of the 20th century, that's where the ethnic and religious identities of Muslims were branded as inferior. So believe it or not, in the apartheid system, they actually graded people and made a system of color. So it was essentially the whites, if you will. And at the least of them were the blacks. And just above them were the coloreds. And in the colored system were the Malay, Indonesian, Malaysian, what became later, and of course Indian ancestry people. So they were even making a distinction to make people fight among each other, saying, well, at least you're better than those people because they're one grade lesser than you or worse off than you. And this was something that not only the apartheid system instituted, but from a religious backing, the Dutch Reformed Church was supportive of this, which is why we have an issue when religion is used, as it was during the slavery in America. Religion was used to maintain slavery, to keep the people enslaved. And Islam, among the first surahs that were revealed, Surah Fajr, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says clearly, among the righteous deeds is fakku rakaba, is to free the slave, as to allow them to be liberated, if you will. And so this was a false faith in the eyes of the colonizers, and it was something that people who were supposed to be learned would not follow, because it's a made-up religion, it's a false faith. So from that, we actually moved to how the Muslims had always been a part of struggle in the South African tradition. And one of the things we want to point out is that what became later the struggle of India for independence actually began at the hands of Gandhi, who became later known as Mahatma Gandhi, but Gandhi, who was actually in South Africa, in what is present-day Transvaal. And there he found a very devastating hit on his psyche, because here he was, a British educated, a barrister, what they call lawyers or barristers. And he came back to that, and in Transvaal, and he couldn't believe that he was being treated just like, the most inferior person, and they were being made to produce documents. You and I, we cross states, like for Thanksgiving, if you drove somewhere, you can go to Maryland, keep going to Pennsylvania, you can go south to North Carolina, nobody asked you for papers. You're inside America. But inside South Africa, for the people who were in these apartheid regime, you had to produce papers. You had to show evidence of your particular neighborhood, where you came from, and if you were too far away, there were consequences for that. And he, at that time, Gandhi said, this is not something human. And he actually organized campaigns to burn those papers in protest and say, this is nothing, it's meaningless. And so the Muslims have been a part of that. They took lessons from that. Then you have, of course, the Muslims within the Muslims themselves, such as here, Dr. Yusuf Dadu, Maulvi Kachalia, and of course Dr. Abdul Rahman. All of them formed the broad liberation movement. People were sick of it from a colored perspective, a black perspective, an inhumane perspective, and so they said this is meaningless to fit into any of these. All of us should be liberated, and all of us should be free together. And so they formed that movement, and the sacrifices that Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool is talking about is specifically of an imam known by the name of Abdullah Harun, who the security forces took, captured, tortured, and ultimately he died in captivity. And this is not something new, because even though he wasn't, let's say, of African descent, their own people. Steve Biko, if you know the history of South Africa, Steve Biko was one of the profound leaders of the pre-apartheid struggle as a student, and there he was, really able to speak the language of the people, motivate them, mobilize them, and he died in captivity. He literally died in captivity. So we knew that someone of African descent would have no less, if you will, leeway than even the other Muslims that we talk about. And so they formed the Call of Islam as the group under the umbrella that they came under, and ultimately became the greatest voice against the apartheid movement. And the parallel I want to draw, because it would be incomplete to just talk about South Africa without talking about the lessons for the United States, is that the Jewish people, when they arrived post-Holocaust from Europe, they were also similarly discriminated in America. But who welcomed them was the African American community. The African American community said, you are coming from a struggle, join us. And that's why when they couldn't go to Princeton, Harvard, Yale, even though they were the most brilliant at that time from Germany and other places, they went to serve in historically black colleges such as Talladega College in Alabama, Tuskegee, of course, and Tougaloo and other places. So this was something. But when the Muslims arrived, when we arrived in 1965, in the dominant arrival of the change in the migration laws, we headed straight to the suburbs. On the most part, we bypassed the inner city, so we actually benefited from the civil rights movement, but we never paid the price that would later on come back to haunt us when people said, well, these are the immigrants. Say, well, what have you done for America? In the South African case, that was never the question, because they were dying, and I'll show you the quote from President Mandela. They were dying, organizing all along, right alongside. They never gave up Islam, but they were right there struggling for the sake and the dignity. And the last line there says that Muslims have been a part of the struggle for freedom, human rights, and dignity all along. So what we know of President Mandela is his life in Robben Island. What we don't talk about a lot is Robben Island was a prison before President Mandela. And the area where it's located, this is from Maulana Ibrahim Bam, he says that there were actually already two other prisoners, Imam Abdullah and Imam Abdul Rauf Badruddin and Nur al-Iman, who were imprisoned on Robben Island. At the time, Nelson Mandela was there. But the Cape Colony, as it came to be known, where Robben Island is located, was already a prison before he arrived. So there was a Muslim presence, and I'll talk about this word karamat. Karamat is used in the sort of South African tradition, but it's a shrine. You may know it as in any other word like dargah, places where a famous imam has passed away and they go there, which is, I don't want to get into the discussions of why we don't do that, but it's there in the tradition. There is a karamat actually located in Robben Island. In Robben Island where President Mandela was sent as a prisoner. And so you'll read about what he says about that in a minute. So Tuan Guru, this is the words used from Sanskrit that come into Malaysia. And Tuan Guru is like the higher Imam, Tuan Guru. And the Malaysians are talking, the title. He was in Robben Island. Yeah, like Guru Nanak, yeah, like who developed the Sikh religion. He was the Hafid of the Quran. He ended up writing several copies of the Quran from memory while in Robben Island. This is pre-Mandela. This is all in the 1700s. This is pre-Mandela. I'm talking about Robben Island was known, as I mentioned, as a prison. And he authored several books on Islamic law, on fiqh and jurisprudence. And he completed all that in 1781. What's ironic is that by the time he was actually freed, he was the age of 82. When he died the same age as President Mandela at the age of 95. He lived all the way up to the age of 95, educating people about Islam, and this was in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So from that came a dawn of a new era, and this is going back to the words of Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, that he says that at the time of the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, in the preparation for democracy, the Muslims just weren't sitting around. They knew something was going to happen. They knew that de Klerk and everybody else was talking about the ridding of the apartheid system, so they did something. 700 and, in terms of a negotiated settlement coming about. So they actually started gathering and started becoming, as an important part of the South African community and made their mark known. What actually happened was that, if you remember the release of President Mandela, a national conference was held. And this is the dream of people in Europe. It should be the dream of people here in America, that at some point we have to come together from all over and say what are the major priorities for Muslims in America. And that's what they did in South Africa. And here, Ambassador Rasool is talking about the conference. He says that 750 delegates from across South Africa, representing every shade of Muslim opinion, every facet of the Muslim community, life, arches, and every type of institution that had been hard won in the dark days of oppression, came together in Cape Town for the National Muslim Conference. What's interesting there is what we don't know much about is that in 1942, in America, the African American community and some of the early immigrants actually had the United Muslim Conference in America. And they were ready to organize to develop the Muslim community. And right then and there they said they had no confusion about who they were as Muslims, about living in America. And in their charter for the conference they said that we know that living in America will have to follow the laws of America and participate in the system of America. So they were ready to vote, although blacks had not yet been given the right to vote. They knew they were going to pay taxes, and they knew they were going to live by the law of the land. This was a confusion that the immigrant Muslims brought in 1965 when we kept questioning, should we vote, should we not vote? And the whole world was passing us by. So it took us 40, 50 years before we organized and said, of course we have to vote, because every issue from the city council all the way to the national level is going to affect us. So of course we have to gather and get together. The South Africans were much ahead of this because they had been fighting for that struggle all along. And so the result of that conference was that they made their needs known to each other, but they also then made the needs known to South Africa at large. I move now to introduce you to, and then we'll have some Q&A inshallah, to words of the president himself. President Mandela, both as he came out of prison, then went on to be elected as the first president of the free Africa, the post-apartheid Africa. And as I mentioned to you, the test of many political leaders is, will you say what you say to us? Will you say that publicly? Because they come and stand in front of us in Adams and other churches and synagogues, and they often say, we are very appreciative of the Muslims, you are great people, this and that. But once they leave, what do? And here was a man who, even when he was in prison, he spoke for the Muslims. When he was out of prison, he spoke for the Muslims. And until his death, as I mentioned to you yesterday, outside of where he was, where he had passed away, Muslims were standing with kufis and beards, and you could tell, because somebody may say, well, how did you know they were Muslims? I saw them on CNN, and that's what prompted me to prepare this talk. And then, alhamdulillah, we have the chance to actually, do it. So, the Muslim community, President Mandela said, is an important section of our population. Its leaders, too numerous to be mentioned, have for decades been in the forefront of the freedom struggle. The combination of the spirit of patriotism and religion has made their contribution to the progress of their country almost peerless, meaning that no other South African community has struggled this much for the liberation of South Africa, peerless, without any kind of distinction. And then he said millions of South Africans of different backgrounds and languages hold the community, referring to the Muslim community, in high esteem. And that's something important, because you want to know what is in the heart of a person, and you want to know what is on the tongue of the person, because sometimes those two are different things. In another setting, he said, describing Robben Island, and it's this kind of, he was talking to Muslims, and he gave always, President Obama and Bush and others give this Ramadan message, and he always gave these messages, but he also came to actually speak to the community, not from a distance. So in one of these gatherings, he was sitting with the Muslims, and he said, it explains to us the makeup of people like Sheikh Matura, from whose karamat on Robben Island, as prisoners, we drew deep inspiration and strength in the darkest times. That contact with Islam through the karamat and the regular visits, because then imams go to prisons here as chaplains. Imam Basir went to Robben Island for the Muslims there, also had its lighter moments. And he's saying something funny. The prisoners were appointed to clean different sections of the prison. But the prisoner who was assigned, all the prisoners lose weight because they're not eating much, they're in prison. But they noticed that the prisoner who was assigned for the karamat, the shrine, the dargah, would always be much bigger, fatter than the others. They say, why is that? So he explains here, he said that it was only later discovered that he had in fact been eating the biryani and the samosas that were left behind for the sheikh, because people bring food for the sheikh, even though the sheikh is dead and gone, but they bring, we don't know why, but they bring food and they bring, sometimes all kinds of things. So these prisoners everybody volunteered to clean the karamat, because they knew in there was tasty biryani and samosas. So he was telling us that we were always associated, even in the lighter moments with the Muslims. In another time he said that our country can proudly claim Muslims as brothers and sisters, compatriots, freedom fighters, and leaders revered by our nation. They have written their names on the roll of honor with blood, sweat, and tears. One of the things that happened when President Obama was running for office was when General Colin Powell, when he came on TV, and somebody asked, basically was posing the question that President Obama is Muslim, and he said, so what if he is a Muslim? And he also then talked about the sacrifice of Salman Khan, who was a young man in New York City, who, when the World Trade Center was falling down, essentially in the middle of those attacks, ran into the towers and helped and tried to save people, and he died in that process. So he showed Americans that if you think these Muslims hate you, here is an example for people to know that they're willing to give up their own life to save somebody else's life. To save somebody else's life. And President Mandela never forgot that. Because in the early days of the apartheid struggle, we know of his imprisonment, the long imprisonment in Robben Island. But he was in and out of prison. Tortured, harmed, affected psychologically, but he never became hopeless. And one of the things is often talked about is that the Muslims who were around him stayed with him and didn't just say when he went to prison that, well, you know, we didn't really know him. If somebody came to ask them, what do you know Nelson? So we didn't really know him. You know, we kind of heard of him. No, some of them went to prison with him. They went to prison with him and spent all of those years in Robben Island. So if you're ever in South Africa and you have not done it, but if you get the chance to visit, they will actually take you to Robben Island and take you to the actual cell in which President Mandela spent so many of his years, and you'll get to see. 27 years, that's right, in jail. And you'll get to see the impact that it could have had, but he never let it bother him. So I'll pause here to give you the present day. When he became, not present day, but when he became president. When he became president, one of the first things people asked him was, what is going to be your cabinet? What will it look like? You know, when President Bush became president, he knew that he was going to have difficulty as a president because he didn't have the depth of history, knowledge, everything. So immediately he surrounded himself by people that were friends of his father who had already served in the American administrations. People like Donald Rumsfeld, people like then who became Vice President Dick Cheney and others. So people were looking to see, is President Mandela going to be vindictive, like angry and upset, and say, no, all these years we fought for the liberation of black Africans. And so the cabinet will be entirely made up of black Africans. Or was he going to say, the cabinet should reflect the needs and the makeup, the composition of the country. And indeed, among the first things he did was appoint Muslims to his cabinet. Muslims to his cabinet. One of the earliest ministers of education was a Muslim at the time. And this was his way of saying, I have absolutely no problem with the Muslims. They are with me and a part of the struggle. So the reason we want to spend some time today to talk about these things as I start to close is that we have to draw lessons. See, too often we're talking about Islamic history to our children, and we talk about dates, names, and places, and people. What we don't talk about is what the lesson that we can draw from that history. And the clear lesson for us as Muslims here is that it may not be in our lifetime that a Muslim rises to the level of prominence as President Mandela did. It may not happen in our lifetime. But if we see struggle in America for human rights, if we see struggle for against injustice, we shouldn't be saying we have to wait because it doesn't affect Muslims. Anyone who fights against hunger, for example, Muslims should be there. Homelessness, for example, Muslims should be there, right? All of these are our causes. And then people will start to say, as they did for South Africans, that don't say anything negative about the Muslims, because not only were they medical doctors and we were their patients, but they also had free clinics, right? Where people could go and get service from them. And this is still possible, because our kids will see us doing this. And it's emotional because for too long we've been looked at as people who just take from America and don't give back. And I think it's high time that each one of us makes this commitment in light of what's happened in South Africa, to say that if they could do it and they could maintain their Islam, we should be doing that. We should be doing everything possible. And this is what he said in the closing. So just the last image is just him standing with the Muslim leaders. And as I mentioned to you, he's a very humble man. He rarely ever wanted the stature, if you will, of the way we treat royalty. He never wanted that. He never went after the people who imprisoned him. He was never vindictive. He showed characteristics in dealing with the people who imprisoned him and oppressed him, similar to and advised by the Muslims, similar to how the Prophet ﷺ reacted and dealt with the Quraysh upon the Fath of Mecca, upon the conquest of Mecca. He looked at them, he looked at all of his enemies who were there in front of him, and said to them essentially, لا تضرب عليكم اليوم, that there is no blame upon you today. You are free to go. And essentially that was probably the biggest da'wah that he could have done in terms of the number of people who then saw this humane treatment and this humane approach to looking at former enemies and prisoners. So I'll pause there. We have about 10-15 minutes before we go. We pray inshallah. So I'll take any comments or questions you have, and any observations you want to share. Yes.
I will add, the autobiography written by Nelson Mandela. I think, I'm not sure, but he visited our Adams and we used to meet in Western in a small community center. I think it was 1982 to 1980.
MashaAllah.
Yes, visited only one time.
MashaAllah. And she wrote an autobiography?
I think she had it.
Okay. MashaAllah.
Legal advisor is a Muslim. His spokesperson was a Muslim.
MashaAllah.
When he was a president and at the retire.
Afterward, MashaAllah. Jazakallah khair. So these are other prominent Muslims who were associates of President Mandela. Yes, sir.
One important thing that I want to understand, or for the benefit of the community, that what would be the take home today in this? One or two things. What did we learn? What did we take? How did we implement that?
Yeah. So just to repeat the question, he's saying, what are the take-home messages? What do we learn from what's happened? We learn a couple of things. We learn, one, that the South African community, as I said, is over 300 some years old. And they never gave up their Islam. Despite all of what I talked about during Dutch rule, during Apartheid, they never gave up the Islam. So their source of strength was always that. Second lesson is that in living their Islam, they didn't just say, we're Muslims and this is who we are. They said, this is who we are, and our religion tells us to go and fight for liberation, for equal treatment of everyone. And struggle is something that people respect no matter who you are. They don't want to hear speeches about how Islam says in Surah Ma'idah, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, O you who believe, stand out for justice, even if it is against your own relatives and kin and other folks. And we keep saying that. But then they look at us and they may say, you are not always with us in the struggle, unless it affects you as Muslims. And so we have to look at that and take that lesson. And some of the issues I mentioned, education is a great issue, healthcare is a great issue, homelessness and hunger are great issues. And when Americans who are not Muslims start to see, because we are also Americans, so we don't just say Americans, but our community at the front of this struggle, then ultimately they will be able to say that these people who believe in this religion, they're driven by their faith. They're driven by their faith. So that was the second lesson. And then the third lesson essentially is the patience with which they handle themselves. We heard of South Africa much before Nelson Mandela was famous, because while he was imprisoned, it was Sheikh Ahmed Didat who made South Africa and the Muslim community famous, because he was a product of South Africa. He understood the Quran, understood the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and could look at the priests and look them in the eye and quote them word for word their Bible and give them the Quran and give them the response. And this energized the Muslims, because they said, ultimately, here we are, we have a spokesperson for ourselves. What we're looking for is not just spokespersons in America, but we're looking for average, everyday people who can then, in American society, do extraordinary things. That's the goal that we should have, is that not everybody is going to become a leader, but not everybody has to be a leader. But every one of us is capable and should be capable of doing extraordinary things. And so that's the takeaway message for us, is to tell our children. And that's why I sat down and I told our children, I said, this is a great man who has passed away. I said that, so now they counted the number of times I've mentioned Mandela since last night. In the car they were saying, you said it again. I said, yeah, we're going to keep saying it because they should know that he was there. He came out of prison and became the president of a nation. And by the way, one thing he said, and he said many things in support of Islam. One time they were calling, I forget if it was Afghanistan or Palestinians, they were calling them terrorists. And he said that you cannot call freedom fighters terrorists because I was once a freedom fighter and you called me a terrorist. You see the connection that he made? He said that don't do this to people because you're basically saying to them, if you stand up for your own liberation, then you are a terrorist. He never, was in support of taking innocent life. That's not, don't get me wrong, especially because these things get recorded and then some things get out of context. What he was saying was the struggle for liberation is a human struggle. And if you stand for that, he also spoke very much against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he challenged the United States, calling it in one statement, calling the United States, why does the US behave so arrogantly? And nobody had done that, not from an African nation. Nobody had stood up like that. And when we went after Iraq for weapons of mass destruction, he said there is another country in the Middle East that has weapons of mass destruction, but you won't go after it because it's your ally. He was very, humble, but very powerful in his words, and he didn't want to be, conveyed as somebody who was weak and just would be, pacified by power. He was in power, and he made sure that he stood for principles. So those are the lessons, that if we stand for our religion, be patient, serve alongside people in the struggle, and of course, have the long-term vision that the South African Muslims had, inshallah, we would benefit in some way. Jazakallah khair for your question. Any other observations or comments? Even yes.
27 years that President released in once.
No, before that he was in and out of prison because they would say he violated something, that they would put him away. Then a few days later he would be out again violated. But when the movement became too strong for them, they said the best way to cut this movement off is to imprison him. And then there was no way to look back at that because they said you cannot come out. It's just done. And that's why it was 27 continuous years. Yeah. And that was, one of the things he wrote about, one of the things he talked about when he came out, was that people challenged him to say, hasn't that made you so angry that 27 years of your life were taken away? And that's when he referred to a lot of the moments with the Muslims and other prisoners learning about the country, the history, the struggles, and actually formulating his future planning. He didn't let prison imprison him mentally. He was, yes. No, go ahead.
There's something that we share that we could say and be able to feel proud of how we can perhaps this time.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela, 27 years, he was cutting salt logs.
Right.
All those years that those salt logs eventually powder and dust burned out of his teardrops.
Subhanallah, yeah.
And then when he came out, the stories he would talk about and would make people cry, but they would read about it.
Right, subhanAllah. That is beautiful. And I think this is what I remember the most, is that I was in undergraduate years when he was released. And I remember that this was a moment that people had never imagined. And they thought that was the end of life. Meaning for him, this is it. He's been released. This is the biggest occasion of his life. And what they couldn't predict was that he had become such a part of the struggle because of his suffering. And you mentioned just the health struggles, but most people talk about the psychological trauma that is imposed on prison. And this is where the US, by the way, one of the things we talk about present challenges is that we are in the world, 5% of the world's population. The US represents 5% of the world's population. But we represent 25% of the incarcerated people in the world. Let me say that again, because I'm talking about the impact that we represent. We are 350 million. That's 5% of the population of the whole world. Because China, for example, is 1 billion, India is 1 billion, and others. That's just 5%. But the number of people we have put in prisons is 25% of the population of prisoners, all of the whole world. And so one of the things that we're doing is solitary confinement, and this is a very inhumane way. And one of the things I can say from President Mandela's life is that if you listen to him, the coherence with which he spoke, it never showed that he missed a beat. Like something had, this is a man is weak, give him some support. Nobody could have pity for him. And in fact, if you read the tweet from Yvonne Ridley, who's the British journalist, just today she said this about him. She said that basically all of the world's leaders are now pouring out condolences and everything else. But all of that, even in death, he makes all of them look insignificant because they did nothing compared to what he did to become the presidents of a nation or even create the liberation of his country. So I would recommend for us to really talk to our children about this, about his life, about his struggle, but especially his friendship with the Muslim community. Because I think our children too often look at ourselves as outside of the picture. Like we see America, but we see outside of the picture. Right now, only 2 of the 535 members of Congress are Muslim. Right? 2. Congressman Keith Ellison and Congressman Andre Carson. So our children look and say, well, we're not in government. If you look, the power for the South African Muslim community did not come from them trying to be a part of the cabinet of the future Africa or future South Africa. It came from them serving where nobody else was serving. They were the people in the streets, serving in the struggle. They were the people who were everything I talked about, the feeding the hungry, the clinics. They are, by the way, you talk about Islam in America, you hear about the MSA, the Muslim Student Association. They were not organized in that sense as students. But our brothers and sisters, some of them are here, living right here, traveled to South Africa in the 1960s. And they helped to establish the MSA. So we already have a bridge. They established the MSA in South Africa, and that became a part of their college student movement. They also established the Islamic Medical Association in South Africa, which was established here, called Imana of North America. And just, subhanAllah, this year, or in September, they opened the plans, and they did the groundbreaking and everything for a brand new hospital. Brand new hospital, a massive hospital built by the Muslims, developed by the Muslims, named after one of the prominent physicians in America who passed away, named Dr. Ahmed Al-Qadi. His daughter is Salma Abu Judairi. You know her here as Salma Abu Judairi, but her family name is Salma Al-Qadi. And this is her father who went there and was a medical doctor known to them. And in his honor, they developed. So the Muslims in America should be thinking, who are the people who sacrificed in America? Not only African Americans, but the immigrant community. And our children should start to know their names, to start to know their life history. All South African children, Muslims, know the life of Imam Abdullah Harun, because he was tortured by the security forces and ultimately died in captivity. In South Africa, Imam Abdullah Harun, for example. But we also don't talk about the Muslim leadership here. We only hear about them afterwards, after they've died. We should be talking about them now, telling our children about their history. Islam, as I mentioned to you in America, has been here for 7 centuries. So it's not new. But the lesson for us is, if the South African Muslims could do what they did and never leave Islam or never compromise on Islam, then we should be able to do the same, if not more, because alhamdulillah, we're living in a country where by virtue of freedom of religion, we can organize, we can get together, and we can, inshallah, mobilize for the betterment of everybody in America, not just Muslims. Right? So that would be my sort of comment to the, in terms of what can we do and the lessons that we can learn. So any last questions or observations, so we can, inshallah, set up for Salatul Isha. Yes, sister.
Did Mandela have any particular religion?
As far as I know, he's Christian. But we never knew anything particular. I don't know anything other than that. I showed the image. What is it? Methodist, yeah. I mean, so within the denomination of Christian Methodist. Yeah, but I don't know that much more about him. But I know in all his public settings, he tried to convey a sort of, not preach by Christianity, but equal to, openly accessible to all South Africans. Yeah, and that's where the Muslims were so close to him. And I began with that image just to show you quickly. Just, when he was with the Muslims, he tried to respect them. And one of the things he said was that his favorite saying of the greeting, the favorite part is the greeting of Assalamu alaikum. So he would greet people in opening gatherings by saying peace, and bringing greetings of peace. And so this is, how, as we say, farewell to a great leader. We look to him for the contributions to all of South Africa, but particularly for the South African Muslims. And indeed for Muslims around the world, because he spoke up for Islam in many ways. As I mentioned, against the war in Afghanistan, the war against Iraq, and of course talking about freedom fighters in the context that they were not terrorists, that they're looking to liberate their land. So we'll pause there, inshallah, and I don't want to overstate the fact that we as Muslims should do more while we're here and really try to improve the condition of our community, so that when the Muslims look back, the Americans look back at our community hundreds of years from now, they can say that there was this Muslim community that came in the 60s and 70s, but they really became a cornerstone of American ideas of social justice and of treating people with dignity and humanity, inshallah. So, Jazakumullah khairan for coming. Thank you again for Adams Center for organizing it at such short notice. But inshallah, there's some benefit, and hopefully in the coming days and years, we'll see more about his life and learn more about his contributions. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.